to the What Even Is podcast, where we interview experts about different topics that makes us wonder, what even is that? Or what even is that like? I'm your host, Donna Trung. Let's get started. Today we're answering what even is it like to be an Arab American with screenwriter, my coworker turned close friend, and more relevant to this episode, Lebanese American Christine Hayek. She also may or may not be related to the actress Salma Hayek. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. You're like one of the two Arab people that I know personally.
Well, I'm glad. I feel like it's a privilege.
So my first question is, what makes someone Arab?
An Arab. So it's interesting because if you look at the definition, it says it's a member of a Semitic people inhabiting Arabia and other countries of the Middle East. And so originally the term Arab referred to the people that inhabited the northern and central portions of the Arabian Peninsula. But that kind of like evolved as we spread out throughout the Middle East. And so it's now, if you look at definitions, they talk about it's, any member of any Arabic speaking people, anybody who originates from an Arab country, participates in Arabic culture, speaks the Arabic language, and also if they're part of the Arab League, which is a member states of 22 countries that were put together.
Well, okay, so you said something about the Arabian Peninsula. What is included in the Arabian Peninsula?
So that's best defined if you see countries like Saudi Arabia, for instance, when people are defining that. And I could even get you a whole list of the Arabian Peninsula right now. But mostly when people talk about that, or they think of movies like Aladdin, usually it's when they think of Arabian Peninsula, they're thinking of Saudi Arabia.
Okay. You know what's so funny is that I didn't even know that Jasmine and the Aladdin. I mean, I guess I should have known by Arabian Nights, but like I didn't know they were Arab.
Yeah. So yeah, I grew up. It's so funny because I grew up looking up to them, and I also, as a kid, didn't really have a knowledge of what it was to be like as an Arab. So as a kid, when I grew up seeing these Disney characters, I had no idea that was my, here are two characters I can relate to until I got actually older. But if you want to know the countries of the actual Arabian Peninsula, you have countries like Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Yemen. So those are specifically the Arabian Peninsula.
So like with all those listed countries, do they all speak Arabic?
They do. They do.
Okay.
It usually, and it's interesting because the Arab League that has the 22 countries, all those countries speak Arabic. And of course, there are some within those that speak a couple of languages. Some are Francophone countries, which means they speak French, for instance.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Is it because the French took over, or?
Yeah, I have a feeling that for the most part, just like in Lebanon, it has to do with who colonized these countries. And Morocco is interesting too because their Arabic is completely different than the rest of the Arab world, but they also speak fluent French as well.
Oh, do they? Well, but like Morocco is like kind of connected to Spain, right?
Yeah, they have. I think even Spain has they have a territory around that area as well, if I'm not mistaken. And of course, they have had their wars in the past with each other.
Yeah, I think I've read some stuff from Latin.
Yeah.
I don't really know if that's true or not. So, like, how you said Morocco has different Arabic than yours, and you said Egyptian Arabic is different too, right? Because we've talked about this before. She's my friend.
Yeah, but it's interesting because at least with Egyptian, because I've watched a lot of their shows, and even though they have their own dialect, and if you look at a lot of even English, we have our own dialects within different parts of the world, right? With Arabic, if you look at Egyptian Arabic versus Arabic in the Levant region, where you get Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Palestine, it is a little different. They use their own words and they pronounce different. Like for instance, if there's a word like jiddan, they use g, so they'll be like giddan, things like that. But it's more easier for me to understand Egyptian than it is for me to understand Moroccan.
Do you think like why it differs so much? I mean, I don't know much about the Egyptian history besides like pyramids and mummies and stuff, but like with Morocco, do you think it's different because of it's like kind of mixing like maybe like Spanish, French, and all of that with Arabic.
Perhaps, and I think I haven't dived into the history of Morocco as much, but I wonder if it also has to do with the ethnic groups of people that were there and their ancestry, and if that was carried over and they've inherited some of that in their language.
Oh, okay,
It'd be
yeah.
interesting. Yeah, it'd be interesting to dissect that because even with Lebanese Arabic, because I'm Lebanese, right? Even with Lebanese Arabic, we use words that other Arabs don't use either, and we will combine English and French with it. Sometimes I'll even use some of the French that I inherited growing up learning. But also, I'm pretty sure there are some Aramaic influences too, because Aramaic was a language of the past too. And you'll also see similarities sometimes with Arabic and even Hebrew words, you know, because Israel's right there, and that's their native language, Hebrew.
Yeah. Can you understand Hebrew, or is it like completely different?
Oh no, no, there'd be like a few words, you know, that I pick up because in Arabic it sounds familiar. For instance, they'll say shalom, right?
Mhm.
And then in Arabic it's salam. It means peace. So
Yeah.
there's just certain things like that that I pick up that I understood.
Okay, so what's the difference? Because I feel like a lot of people think that Arab and Middle Eastern, even before me meeting you, I'm not gonna lie, I'm pretty ignorant on a lot of stuff because I've never been really exposed to like Middle Easterns or Arab people in general, just because I live in an area where it's mostly Spanish people, so I know more about like Spanish
Yeah.
people and the Latin culture more so. But what's the difference between being Middle Eastern and Arab?
So this is so interesting because as I was doing my research these last few nights, I found that I was going through this weird identity crisis of wait, what countries are part of the Middle East? Because there's a lot of like sources that they have differing answers. Um, but before I get into that, I guess I'll explain the difference, the specific difference of Arab people. You know, as we've mentioned, Arab people are members of the Arabic speaking group. They are part of an Arab country that participate in Arabic culture and the language, right? Whereas in the Middle East, you have various ethnicities and racial identity may differ among other Middle Eastern people, right? So you have countries like Iran, where their first language, it's not Arabic. Of course, a lot of Muslim people, they have to learn the Quran. It's in Arabic, right? So they are familiar with it, but it's actually Farsi that they speak in Iran, for instance. And so they would not be considered Arab people, but they will be considered people of the Middle East, Middle Eastern country. But what's interesting about being Middle Eastern, it's such a complicated question, right? Because if you look at, they tried to actually change the consensus, the U.S. consensus, to add the MENA category, which stands for Middle East, North Africa, which is basically trying to specify those people of various ethnic groups from the Middle East and North Africa. So in North Africa, you know, you have Morocco and Egypt, and in the Middle East, the common countries you could think of are those of the Levant, like Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan. What's interesting to me is that the Middle East region was actually originally coined in the early 20th century to designate the area between the British colony of India and the Near East, so the Balkans and the western part of the Ottoman Empire. And if you look at different sources, they add on, they subtract countries depending on what these sources deem to be the Middle East. Sometimes they'll add Afghanistan into the Middle East, and it'll be considered, okay. Sometimes, Afghanistan won't be included into that group of people.
Is
Um,
Afghanistan, I'm trying to think of the geography, but if I'm being real, I don't really know it that well. Is that in Africa? Like
no, so
northern?
it's in Asia, and it actually borders near Pakistan.
Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah, okay, yeah.
Yeah, so if I even pull up a map on my end, let me grab it for you. And that's why also you see some, political issues between Pakistan, India, Afghanistan. Um, a lot of, you know, Afghani refugees have made their way to Pakistan during the wars that they've had to deal with. Yeah, so near Afghanistan, it's actually borders right of Iran. So I could see why, some maps and some sources will group them in together as part of the Middle East. But it's interesting because you also have Pakistan, you have India, you have Uzbekistan, you have Kazakhstan. These are all on the right of to the right of Iran. You
They
know,
wouldn't be part of the Middle East. right?
Well, what's so fascinating to me is in my mind, and from what I've grown up to learn, it was like the cutoff was Iran to me. But then I've realized that people aren't necessarily wrong to group them into the Middle East because it's such a it's a construction. The Middle East was it was a term that was coined by the British colony to distinguish a certain territory. So it's not really set in stone. Um, but of course, within the Middle East, like I said, there are various ethnic groups. Whereas being an Arab, you can be from the Middle East, but you don't necessarily have to be. You're even from Iran, you're Middle Eastern, but you're not Arab. So
Yeah.
it's interesting to me.
Wait, is Arab, would you like coin it as like an ethnic group or is that
So I knew this
incorrect?
would come up because I started to. Uh, what's interesting is I guess Arab people, we come in all shapes, colors, sizes. You could be a black Arab, you could be a really white Arab. I'm a white passing Arab myself. And so it leads to some issues of identity. And I looked up, ethnicity versus race. And I guess if we were to better describe it, I guess it's the same as Hispanic and Latino people. And the way we categorize them here is almost like the way maybe we should possibly categorize Arab people. Because ethnicity is a social group that shares a common and distinctive culture, religion, or language, and it also refers to a person's ethnic traits, background, allegiance, association. So I looked that up. I got information of, well, what is ethnicity, what is race, um, and I actually find myself to have more of a identity crisis, kind of questioning that, because now I notice on doctors, like my new doctors, for instance, is so random, but I noticed that they added that as a race category, being Arab, so I could now check it off. But what's
What did
even
you
more
use
interesting,
before?
it was either other or you just say Caucasian.
Okay.
Yeah. And what's even more fascinating, the term Arab for me in the household was actually like a taboo.
Oh, was it?
It was not accepted for me as a Lebanese Christian to say that. And it's reflecting on it now. I think it has to do with politics of the Civil War without getting into too much details of it, and association, well, oh, no, we're not Arab. I was told we're Phoenician, which is our ancestry, right? But if you go to Syria, they have their own ancestry too, and their ancestral people are not necessarily grouped as technically Arab. They have their own ethnic group as well. So it was interesting to me growing up to hear that, and kind of as I was trying to form my identity, well, what does it mean then to be an Arab? What does it mean to be a Lebanese person? Well, then why aren't we considered Arab? And so now, as my generation has grown up, and we've had the general definition of an Arab being, of a group of an Arabic speaking group of people, or being from an Arab country. Well, then, okay, if we coin it this way, then of course I'm Arab. If we want to go back to genealogy, and if we want to go back to the original Arab people, of course, it all started in the Arabian Peninsula. And if you want to go there, and if we want to be that precise, perhaps maybe we aren't the original Arabs by that definition.
Mm.
Um, but perhaps my ancestors are from there. You just never know, because my ancestry is from the middle. I'm from Lebanon. Of course, I have some Syrian ancestry in me as well, and who knows where that lineage goes back to.
Yeah, that's kind of there's just so many layers to it, it sounds like, because it's like honestly, if I'm being real, I thought it'd be like, oh yeah, it's like an ethnic group and then it's just kind of like spread out more, but then it goes more into like different definitions,
Exactly.
basically.
And people from the Middle East, it's such a diverse group. Lebanon alone has 18 different religions, and so if we want to look at the Middle East as a whole, imagine the amount of religions, the groups of people, the ethnic groups of people that make up the entire region. It's just it's more than just being Arab. There are other groups of people in that region. So, and if you look at even, I was watching this side note. I don't know if you want to edit this out eventually, but I was watching a History Channel thing, and they were trying to do their own form of ancestry to prove people's migrations actually did begin in Africa, and they were able to prove that. We started in Africa, then the Middle East, then I think even eventually Europe, and then they just started to spread out more. So I'm sure if I went far back enough, I may have lineage there. I may not. But what I do know is for certain is the definition of what an Arab is today is what makes you an Arab. You practice the culture, you speak the language. Of course, we have certain features that similarities in our features, not all the time, but I think the same goes for a lot of different groups of people.
For
There's
sure.
always that stereotype in the Western world that you have to be, for an Arab, you have to be brown, you have to have black hair, but dark brown hair that looks black, I would say. You have to wear a hijab, to be considered an Arab woman, or to look like this picture that they have in their minds of what an Arab is. It definitely influences and affects you growing up. Because for me, I felt like I had to defend the value of my Arabness, because I didn't necessarily look like the stereotypical image of what an Arab woman looks like to a lot of people, because they were just growing up and looking at things based off of what the media was showing them.
Yeah, that makes sense, because when I first met you, I honestly didn't even know that you were Arab. I just thought you were white. But then you were talking about like, I forget what you said. You said something about your mom yelling at you or hitting you with a shoe. And then you're like, well, that's what happens when you grow up in like an Arab household. And I was just like, huh. So she's not white.
Yeah. It's so funny because I have a hairdresser too, and like she's like, oh, I wouldn't have known either. She's like, oh, but you look Armenian. And it's so funny to me because Armenia is not necessarily right next door, but we do have an Armenian population in Lebanon. They do have similar features and characteristics to us, and it's like, to me, they have similar features to what an Arab is to me. From what I grew up in the Levant region. I mean, I grew up with having the background of being Lebanese, which is in the Levant region, and so there are a lot of Arabs that kind of look like me, and there are Arabs that are darker. If you go to Sudan, you have black Arabs, and so it's fascinating to me, because even a black Arab may not necessarily fit the role of what an Arab looks like to people here.
Right. Yeah. So what are some misconceptions that Americans have about Arabs? Or even just the Western, even like Western oh my God, civilizations. Like what misconceptions do they have?
Yeah, the first big one is they think that all Arabs are Muslim. And one of my teachers in 7th grade, I'll never forget it, because I think she taught this lesson on purpose, because I was in the class to kind of teach kids a lesson about this. And she was like, not all Arabs are Muslim, and not all Muslims are Arabs. For me, like I said, I mentioned Lebanon alone has 18 different religions. And for me, I grew up a Catholic, an Eastern Catholic, Christian. And it's so interesting to me, because I feel like even within the Christian community, I felt like a minority. I have Catholic friends that till this day, and they're very devout, had no idea about their Eastern counterparts. It just leads to a lot of like a crisis, of an identity crisis, because it's so interesting, because the Middle East it's where the Holy Land is. Even Lebanon is part of the Holy Land as well. It has some religious history as well, and it's the birthplace of the Abrahamic religion. So it's not just Islam, it's Judaism, it's Christianity. And so the other part of it is that not all Muslims are Arabs. Only 20% of the Muslim population actually make up being Arab.
Oh, really?
Yeah, 80%. So of course the Muslim population in the Arab world, they dominate in numbers, right? I don't know how to say this more. The majority of Arabic speaking people are Muslim right now in the Middle East, living in the Middle East. So Arabs only compromise about 20% of the world's Muslim population, meaning 80% of the world's Muslim population are outside of the Arab world, and they're not Arab.
Yeah.
You could be a Muslim from Albania and not be Arab.
Yeah.
Or even in Afghanistan and Pakistan, they're not considered Arab. So that's another stereotype, is they assume that because someone is Muslim that they're Arab.
Yeah.
And the first question I used to always get, not so much now, but I used to always get the question of, like, when they find out who I am, are you Muslim?
Oh, really?
That was always a question. And I had no, I never took it as an offense. And I didn't ever blame people, because I feel like it's what they were exposed to here growing up. It's all they knew. I took it as a learning point for them, and in my time to kind of enlighten people of what is out there in the Middle East, and how we're actually more diverse than people think we are, and kind of give voice to being a minority within the minority group.
Right. Yeah. So when okay, so background story. Me and Christine, we shared cubicles. And I think like when I first joined, it was around like Easter time, and you had like a picture of like Jesus
Yeah,
on your cubicle thing. And I think like because at that point I already knew that you were Arab, but I didn't know that you were Christian. Or maybe I did. I don't really know. I don't remember. But I remember thinking like, whoa, like for me, because again, I was exposed to just thinking that Middle Eastern and Arab people are just Muslim. That's all
yeah,
I knew. But then when I met you, like you explained to me more about like the different the differences and stuff like that. And I don't think I outrightly said like, "Oh, you're Christian." I just
yeah.
saw the Jesus thing, and I was just like, I just accepted it. I was just like, that's weird, because I would have thought she's like Muslim, but then I just walked right past it. I was like, okay, whatever. I'm just gonna start working now.
Yeah, so it's like, it's such an interesting thing, because growing up Arab American, it differs based off of your background as well, and not one person is the same. And that was one of my biggest things, was kind of giving a voice to being this minority within a minority, kind of like making a case for being a Christian Arab, giving a voice. That was
Right.
my thing growing up, like always wanting people to know, like, hey, did you know that, like, in the Middle East, that I'm an Arab, but I'm also a Christian, and it's my Muslim friends know, of course, because they grew up in this community, in this world, so they know about us, they know we exist, we're friends with each other. And it's just so funny that outside of the community, it took a while to see people being more open to it. I do kind of see a page turning. I do see people being more aware. I remember looking at Iraq recently in the last 6 years, and them dealing with, I mean, they've dealt with their fair share of war, but dealing with ISIS, and the Yazidi population getting it the most. There was an active genocide against them, and even with the Christians there. But I even found myself thinking, oh, wow, like, what are the Yazidis? Like, I didn't even know who these people were until till this whole situation in our world happened the last 6 years. So it was very interesting to me, to as I grow up and I learn more about the region and more about um, people from there and their backgrounds, just what is out there. And I'm sure even till this day, other people will not know that Christians even exist in Iraq, and or even that Yazidi is a group. I guess for me, I search for it more, because I feel drawn to it, and I feel drawn to the region. I feel drawn to the people.
Well, I feel like it's also because it's such a big part of your identity too.
Yeah.
Because for you, like, okay, for you, I feel like you more so than for me. Like, yeah, I'm like half Chinese and half Vietnamese, but I can't speak either language like that. And even like my Chinese, it's a dying language. So, like, no one really speaks it like that. So for me, I'm just like, well, oh, why am I going to learn how to speak it if no one even can speak it around me, really? But for you, because you're actually fluent in Arabic and you actually like visit your family and stuff, and you
Mm.
I feel like for you, you're probably more drawn to Lebanon specifically than like me in Vietnam or China, because for me, I don't think I would be able to like fit in. I mean, I'll fit in, like they'll try to speak to me, I'm all like, I don't sorry, I don't understand you. And then they'll have to like switch. But like for you, you can like actually make it in Lebanon, like because you know the language and stuff like
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
But it's interesting, because as I've gotten older, I feel like I get rusty sometimes if I don't speak it
Hmm.
as often. It was my first language, by the way. I was born in America, but it was my first language up until first grade, and so I had to get extra, you know, English and comprehension classes. Um, but as I become an adult, I find myself being nervous to speak it, be out of fear of saying the wrong things. But when I went to Lebanon last year, I would just like, it took a week and I was just like back to where I was, you know.
Yeah.
So for me, it was a matter of trying to hold on to my native tongue. um, it's symbolic for me because I feel like if I start to uh, if I start to lose my language, if you know, what else am I losing? And I feel like I'm slowly moving away from my identity. It's a big part of me, and I don't want to lose it. So it's this constant thing, and not everybody's like has an interest in this, right? For me, it's something that it's important to me, but not necessarily for other people. For me, it's I've just held on to it.
Right. Yeah. I feel like it's a good thing though, because then well, your parents know English, but like I feel like it's just like another way of communicating to
Yeah,
other like different people.
yeah.
And I think that's why I find value in like learning different. I know it's like super contradicting where I'm all like, oh, I don't really want to learn my language, but like for you, Arabic is actually widely spoken.
Yeah. But you're learning other languages too. Like you have that interest, so
Yeah, I mean, I'm only really learning Spanish, but for me, the reason why I started learning it was because there's so many Spanish people here,
yeah.
and it'd be cool to like just be able to communicate with people who can't really speak English, and just to make it a little bit easier for them.
Yeah, well, that's really great. I think that's really cool. I'd like to learn Spanish soon too. I've kind of had a past in learning some French, but I've had an
You know,
interest
like
eventually.
with Arabic and Spanish, they actually have some words. I saw
Hmm.
like a YouTube video, and I was just like, wow, that's kind of cool.
I think it has to do with actually in the past when I don't know if it was the proper word is the Moors um, when they conquered. I don't know if they've conquered Spain. We have to
Spain,
fact
yeah.
check this later. There's definitely an influence of uh, Islam in Spain,
Hmm.
um, and in the culture, even if in its architecture as well. And I think there was even a town or a city. I don't know if it's called Andalusia. I don't. I could be saying it wrong. But if you ever find the time to look into this, there was a city where Jewish, Christian, and Muslim people lived in unity for hundreds of years. Very fascinating, and very promising. And I think more people need to learn about this history.
Well, I feel like people, I mean, again, I'm in my little bubble, so it's just like in my head, everyone gets along. But I know there are regions where people don't actually get along because of religion or
Yeah,
like ethnic background. But I feel like there is a lot of evidence of people of different religion backgrounds, different ethnic backgrounds being able to live in peace. Like
yeah,
if you even look in like the United States, I mean, obviously there's going to be people where they're like, oh, I don't like people that are not like me, and I'm going to be like super rude or I'm going to be violent against them. But I think the vast majority, at least here from what I know, is that a lot of people get along despite religion, despite
yeah.
ethnic background and all that.
Yeah, I mean, even in I don't know if it was Vienna. I think Vienna. I don't know if you've seen there were recent terrorist attacks, right? There's a lot of issues going on in this world, and there was actually a group of Muslim people that are protecting the church right now, and preventing, it's kind of like as a shield to prevent any attacks from happening, because in the last couple of weeks there was a couple of terrorist attacks that have taken place in Europe, specifically in France and now in Vienna. And so it was, I think, of course, conveniently enough, you never see these type of stories airing in Western media.
Yeah.
Combat the other stereotype of, well, does that mean that there's some animosity now towards Christians, or is this like a Islam versus the West? Is this, you know what I mean? There's just like, there is extremism, there is religion, and I think within religion, of course, there's extremism in a lot of faith and different groups of people. But it was really great to see, and I think that a lot of people need to be aware of it.
Yeah, I think the media definitely plays up more of the negativity if we're being real. Like they're not
Yeah.
gonna show like the good stuff that's happening because it's not as interesting as like the
Yeah.
bad stuff. So like maybe in our mind we think that there is a lot of like differences, but I feel like maybe because I'm in Enneagram 9, which is a peacemaker, but like I feel like the majority of people just want peace. They don't want to fight.
Exactly.
They don't want to be like caught in this war or caught into like these different biases.
Yeah.
um I might be wrong, but I think I have maybe more of an optimistic view compared to other people.
I'm the same way.
Maybe we're
I'm the
naive,
same.
whatever.
Because my family, I grew up learning more about the Civil War in Lebanon and what that meant, and of course, I feel like if we're being honest, there was some paranoia that they instill in you, and you kind of question. You go about your own journey of, well, what is truth? Do people really hate us? Are we supposed to hate people or because of their background? What does that mean for us? Um, and I think it's important to kind of, like you said, be optimistic and really look at the positives and really, really see it in a worldly way of, well, look at these people and this is evidence of unity, and we can't just look at certain isolated situations or even sad moments in our past and all of a sudden just label a certain group of people as an enemy.
Yeah. It also sucks too because it's also just conditioning when you're like a
Yeah.
kid, because it's not like something that you're subconscious about. It's more like, oh, what did your parents tell you? What is society telling you? And then if this is all that you believe, some people don't want to go against the grain of what they already believe, because then at that point it's kind of an identity
Yeah.
crisis for them because they have to question everything. And
Yeah.
maybe some people don't want to live in that question or be confused either.
What's beautiful though to see is last year in Lebanon there was the beginning of the revolution where people have just had enough. There's a lot of corruption, right? And warlords from the civil war were ruling the country, and the way that the government is created, it's a sectarian. It's based off sectarianism. So different groups of people rule the country. So, for instance, the president has to be Christian. Um, the prime minister has to be a Sunni Muslim, and the Speaker of the House has to be a Shiite, and then they split the House and whatnot. Um, but what's great was people just took to the streets and they've had enough with these warlords running the country. They've had enough with the corruption. They've had enough with sectarianism, politics. They've had enough with these people in power pitting them against each other. And it was so promising and it was so wonderful to see. There's even a picture out there, of it, you see imams and you see holding hands with the priest and a Druze leader. I don't know if you've ever heard of this group of people, but it's Druze.
I've never heard of.
Yeah, so it's a
Yeah.
group of people. It's a religious group.
Mhm.
So all these leaders took to the streets, held hands in unity, and it was so great to see because of just even Lebanon's own fair share of civil war and people kind of being pit against each other. So yeah.
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 We went kind of deep there.
Yeah.
So after changing topics,
Yeah, sure.
after 9/11, what was there, did you face any racism after 9/11, or like did any other Arabs that you know faced any?
Yeah. So I've dealt with some racism, but I feel like it's not as much as the men in my family and community, and of course not as much as my Muslim friends, especially if it's a woman who wears a hijab, right?
Mhm.
They've dealt with more, and I think it also depends on what part of the country you're from. For
Mhm.
me, being in the Northeast, but being uh, near Boston, I feel like I didn't experience it as much as other people. Like in New York, I had a family member had changed their son's name because they were afraid. This was right
Yeah.
after 9/11. Um, and I think the big difference between now versus, well, before 9/11 and after was more conversations were had about my identity, like more conversations were had about what it was to be a Middle Eastern person, an Arab person, and my background. More people were curious about my background. I became more aware, if anything, of the microaggressions. the jokes started coming in,
Yeah.
the shocker, like the most like famous joke of them all are the terrorist bomb jokes,
Wait, but do people that are not Arab or Muslim actually say that to you? Like they would
I've
say,
had that. I've had that being said to me in school
really?
once. Yeah, like the terrorist jokes are like, oh, like we're in an assembly right now. Like, oh, like is there a bomb that's about to be set off? But that was just like I feel like that was a. What's interesting about that moment, because I do remember that day where I was just like taken back by this friend saying this to me, was he knew he was wrong right after he said it and he apologized for it
Oh, okay,
because
yeah,
he saw
because
how uncomfortable I was.
yeah, that's kind of
Yeah.
distasteful, I think.
Yeah, and I had a teacher who, for sure, for me actually, I will say the microaggressions that I've dealt with were definitely in the classroom and in a school setting. And I actually had a teacher that just wouldn't stop. He was part Armenian, and so that was his justification in making it okay to say a lot of the things he said. Like, oh, like I'm with you guys, I'm one of your buddies, and let me make these jokes about deserts and like the way you dress and things like that. And it wasn't okay. And I actually have had multiple conversations with this teacher because the kids would laugh with his jokes, and for me it wasn't of like they weren't laughing because they were convinced it was just a joke. For me it's like you don't, I had to tell this teacher, you don't understand, like they're believing you. He just wouldn't stop. And
Yeah.
like I said, he used his like part uh, of his identity to kind of group himself with the Arab people so that he can justify saying all these different things to me.
I think it's like kind of tough though because he's a teacher, and then if these kids aren't really exposed to like a certain group of people, not just like Arab, if he made jokes about, or if any teacher made, or anyone really made any type of joke against like a certain group of people, and if the audience isn't really exposed to that group of people, then they're just gonna believe that's how it is.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember even for like a Halloween thing they did in school, like these kids came in dressing as Arabs.
Well,
You know.
wait,
Yeah. Yeah.
wait.
Like the
How did,
traditional tribal, like their way of like traditional tribal, they wore like a I don't know what it's called in English, but it's called a keffiyeh. It's a specific scarf, and they wore it over
mm,
their heads, and they wore like these outfits to kind of look like um, uh, people from a specific part of the Middle East. And yeah, so there was that, like they thought it was okay, or it was so weird for me. I guess that's how Native Americans feel, I'm sure, when people wear
like
things
the
like,
feathers.
yeah, like the
Yeah.
feathers or things like that. Um, it's definitely like a small burn, for me. It was to see that, but I try not to let it get to me. Um, and like the men in my family, they get stopped at the airport more often. We make jokes out, like they're flagged. I've had family members who've come from Lebanon and they get interrogated. They ask them like the weirdest questions,
Do
like
they?
very specific questions, just to see what group they're associated with within the country, especially now. Yeah, it's very interesting without getting into too much detail, but that does happen. um I feel it, but I don't know if that's considered, for me that's not really racism. I personally wouldn't see it as that. I think it's definitely a extra vetting process because you know maybe for extra security concerns.
Mm.
um but that definitely does happen more often.
Have you ever been stopped? Well, honestly, you kind of look white, so like I feel like
It's in my, I mean, so it's interesting because for me, it's more of I'm more outed if I'm speaking the language, if I'm around my family members and things like that. You'd be surprised though, like what I guess your background and what you're exposed to, people see it in me. Arabs
Mhm.
see it in me. Arabs know that I'm Arab. It just is what it is. There's this funny thing that on the street or in the store, if you notice another Arab, we like eye each other. There's like this like nod of like acknowledgement that we're both Arab,
Oh,
you
I see. Yeah.
know. um, but because I'm a woman and because I'm not Muslim, so I don't wear and I don't choose to wear a hijab because of course that's not in my religion. I think it's easier for me to get by and not being stopped. I've never been stopped at the airport. I think
Okay.
maybe in France, I felt a little bit of it. I don't know if it's because they saw where I was heading to, from Lebanon to I'm from France to Lebanon. I don't know if it was in the way I was treated by these officials. That was probably the only glimpse I've ever had. I have to say I've had it easier than the men in my family for sure. But so there's this filmmaker though that I really like. This is kind of like going with racism, and she's definitely white passing. And I've watched her movie Imbrika, which I recommend, by the way. She's a Palestinian American, and it's loosely, certain events in the movie is loosely based off of her family. Her name is Shireen. I don't know how to pronounce her name in English, but like for lack of just figuring out how she pronounces in English, I'll just say Shireen Davies. If you want to ever look up her work, really talented. And I saw that, you know, I read about her history and I compared it to what was going on in the movie. You know, of course, in the movie she moved it up in current events, but in real life there was a situation going on in the Middle East. I don't know if it was like a Gulf War or something. And somebody in school, this was in the 90s, somebody in school made up this rumor that her brother, which she doesn't even have a brother, was in like Saddam Hussein's army, and the FBI actually took it seriously and like barged into the school. And like her dad, who's a doctor, almost lost his practice. And they're Christian, you know, so it didn't even matter.
Yeah.
It didn't matter to them. It just, an Arab is an Arab.
Yeah.
So just to see how crazy things that can get, and I think she grew up in the Midwest, and I don't know if that makes a big difference. But just to see that it does happen. I know I read a story a few years ago, a Lebanese man also, like I'm telling you, even him, for you probably look at him and you're like, oh, he doesn't look Lebanese at all either. There was a hate crime committed against him, and it was a country in the South. I forgot specifically where.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, you know, he called out of fear to the cops, and the cops checked the house. Everything was fine. They said there's nothing we can do, and then moments later he got shot and killed. It was deemed a hate crime. So it does happen. And I'm sure, actually, even my mom's dealt with racism growing up here, because she grew up here. She was born in Lebanon, but she grew up here, so she got to kind of experience that as well. My dad got to experience it in college, because during the time he was here, it was the Iranian hostage crisis, and they associated him with him being Iranian. And
Mm-hmm.
so there was that. And also he decided out of nowhere, because there was another Lebanese friend who went to Mississippi State to go there. So of course that was just like a lot of racism that they've dealt with. So it's definitely happened in my family. I think I think I'm blessed in kind of like the generation I grew up in and where I grew up, that it didn't happen to me as much. Definitely microaggressions, things like that, but not as blatant as a lot of the men in my family, or even family from New York.
Mm-hmm.
So it definitely helps where I grew up.
I have a question. So
Sure.
like after 9/11, I would imagine that maybe even though people didn't identify with the people that did 9/11, was there like a sense of fear? You were like, "Oh shit." Like so, oh, I swear. Oh, whatever. Uh, um like, "Oh shit, like this like these people did it and now we might be targeted after as like an aftermath type of it." Was there like a sense of fear of that? I mean, I don't know how old you were when it happened, so you were
I was 11. I was 11, and I feel like I was sheltered from that a little. But I definitely was taken out of school immediately when it did happen. I think out of fear of us being targeted, but also we did know a family friend. Like my mom had a family friend who was Lebanese himself, who was on one of the planes, and he had passed from 9/11. But like I said, I think it was more of my awareness, because I actually didn't form my identity of being a Lebanese, but I didn't know really what that fully meant, being Lebanese, being Arab, all these things, until after the third grade. In fact, I remember growing up being in shame of my identity. Like I hid it from school. My brother and I, like it was just this big secret that we didn't tell our friends that we were Lebanese. It wasn't until third grade in a classroom when a teacher put on a video about ancient Egypt, and she randomly asked the class, who here is Arab or Lebanese? And like I saw a girl raise her hand, that's when I raised my hand too, and that's when everything became more out in the open. And then, of course, a year later, 9/11 happens. So I definitely think I was more aware of things. I was more aware of microaggressions. I was forming my identity more, kind of learning what it meant to be an Arab, and like I said, also defending the value of my Arabness to people. I felt like I always had this constant need to defend myself of this is who I am. It's funny too because little things when you're kids kind of like give you clues of, oh yeah, that's for sure. Like even if I hid it from people that I was Arab as a kid, they definitely had clues because I was eating hummus, and they'd be like, "What is that?" And then it's
Yeah.
not, and it's more of a "What is that?" and I'm disgusted of what you're eating kind of thing, and it's
Like
so
you would
funny.
bring lunch to school or
Yeah, I'd
something?
bring lunch to school, and of course, it would be a Lebanese meal like hummus or something else, and they'd ask, "What is that?" But not out of curiosity, out of like, "Ew, what is that?" And it's so funny because I feel like America now kind of runs on hummus, whereas in
Yeah.
the past, I was made fun of for it.
I mean, I'm sure it's the same how like when Asians first came, they were like made fun of for their food. Like
Yeah,
for me, I definitely was scared to bring food to even work because I was just like, oh my God, like I don't want people to like I'm not gonna lie, some Asian food it's very like pungent, right? But it smells good. It just smells different than what other people are used to eating. So I would just get like self-conscious about it.
I'm the
Um
same. Sometimes I wouldn't bring certain foods because of the smell.
Yeah, like with some, there was this one time I remember I was like at work. This was when I worked in retail, and my dad he brought me food, and it was like one of my favorite dishes. It was like pork and shrimp, but I don't know like what they make the sauce out of, but it's very like pungent. And then like I was eating it, and then someone came in, like one of my coworkers came in. He was just like, "What are you eating?" Like in a disgusted like tone. He was just like, "Oh, it smells so bad here," and I was just like, "Oh, I don't know. It's just like." Pork and like shrimp. And he was like, okay, well, I'm allergic to shrimp, so you have to wipe everything down. And then I'm like, okay, like whatever.
And to you, would you consider that like a microaggression?
Um, I think I took an offense because it was like something that maybe not so much a microaggression, but I think it like for anyone, it's rude to be like, ew, what are you eating? Like basically in the tone, like no matter who it
Yeah,
is, that's rude. Like you don't say that because it's like whether it's your culture, oh it doesn't even matter, it's just like whatever you're eating, like I get like maybe you don't like it but I like it, you know.
yeah.
um
It's so interesting that we talk about food because it has a history. Like people didn't want to eat garlic because it associated them with Italians. Italians introduced garlic to America, and they were just like, ew. And it's funny because I use
love,
garlic. We love garlic. It's
yeah,
a Mediterranean thing.
yeah, Asian people too, we love
Yeah.
garlic.
Or even okay, so here's another one, MSG. MSG, it's a specific flavor that's used in a lot of Asian food.
Hmm.
And people are like, oh no, like no MSG, please, because they think they're gonna get sick from it. But I watched a small documentary and they mentioned how that's actually like a racist stereotype. They made people afraid of eating MSG because of
It
where
was
it's from.
associated with like
Yeah,
Asians, yeah.
exactly. The only way it will kill you is if you like inject it, which is like any other. Even if you like, I don't know, maybe inject
Inject
salt
salt
in your
into your
stomach, you're
bloodline.
you're gonna
Yeah,
die. Yeah,
yeah,
but like if you eat it, you're fine. Like you're not
yeah.
supposed to get sick from it.
there
So
was
it's
this
interesting.
there was this one thing I forget where it was on Netflix, and the host of the show was his name is David Chang, and he's an Asian chef, and he did like a whole episode. It's on Netflix. I think it's called Ugly Delicious. I think
I will
the
look that
show.
up for later.
Yeah, and that one actually he talks about Lebanese food and how it's integrated in Mexican cuisine too.
Word.
Yeah, there was another episode of that, and I think I Skyped you when I saw
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
I think you mentioned that, and I think I actually told my boyfriend about it because I was making chicken tacos, and then I looked it up out of curiosity because I know you mentioned it, and I
Hmm.
didn't know what the documentary was, but I looked it up, and I think it's the shawarma dish, the Lebanese shawarma, which is like the beef or the chicken, that was incorporated into the way they make their tacos.
Yeah, I think that's what it was. I think, I mean, I'm not gonna fake false facts. I don't know, but you can watch the documentary.
Yeah, I will definitely look that up. Thank you.
But he talked about how MSG, like they did like a study, like kind of like an in-person thing where they said like, oh, this doesn't have MSG in it. How do you feel? And then like after they fed them like something that did have MSG, or they said that there was MSG in it, and then they said how they felt. And I think like that whole study, I don't really remember the details of it, but he was saying like, so all of it had MSG in it, and you didn't think anything, you didn't feel anything after you ate this. But then I think there was also a thing where MSG is in a lot of stuff, like Doritos or something.
Yeah.
But when after you eat Doritos, you don't feel any type of way. I mean, if you don't eat that stuff, obviously you're gonna feel gross. But
I
like,
love chips. I haven't had them in a while, but I will still eat them any day.
yeah, Doritos, that's my shit. But basically it was just saying like MSG doesn't have any effects. It's just because you know that there's MSG in it and you have an association with MSG, so you're gonna start feeling that way because
Yeah.
of it.
It's so crazy how like it was passed. It gives me the chills, and maybe I'm over dramatic, but just like to think that it has it's something that was kind of like it had a racist tendency that was passed on from generation to generation, and we had no idea what the culprit was or why we even thought, oh, MSG is probably not good, let's order food without MSG. It's a flavoring.
Yeah, literally.
It is a literal flavor. And can you imagine if people were still against garlic? Like that would be just like not okay with me.
It would be like there's no flavor in their food.
Yeah.
You know, like when recipes say like 3 cloves of garlic, I'm like, okay, I'm putting 6.
Yeah, exactly what we do.
So what's your favorite part of Arab culture?
For me, it's we have this like sense of pride. Maybe within the Arab culture, I would say like being Lebanese more so. Because for me, it's this just stands for this resiliency of its people, and um, just literally so many things could happen to my people, and they just get back up and continue on with life, and it's
Mhm.
just beautiful to see. I know that sounds so cliche. It probably does. But
Well,
it's
my point is like I feel like if a lot of us made it this far, I feel like most of us are resilient. Like
yeah,
our people are resilient, you know?
yeah,
Like with Asian people, especially when they first came to build like the Chinese specifically, they first came to build the railroads, like they managed to get back up even though they were getting paid like shit.
yeah,
And like they were all of the abuse that all minorities came like all minorities like experienced, we
yeah.
all got back up and we're still going,
I
basically.
mean, we all made this country.
Yeah.
People from different backgrounds. And it's so sad that we don't have we don't have movies to document it, or even more media content, because of course, the railroads weren't created just by, white people that just came into the United
Yeah.
States, into the New World.
Yeah, for
Like
sure.
where are more stories of Asian Americans? Where are more stories of Arab Americans? Where are more stories of Indian Americans? I just don't get it. I don't get how it's almost like it feels erased. We have to almost dig in to find it.
Yeah, I mean, it also definitely has a big part of it is the the people that work in Hollywood, which
Oh
is
yeah.
vast majority white. So it's not like they really, because it's not so personal for them, like
Yeah.
they don't think to tell the story.
Yeah. Can you believe too, like My Big Fat Greek Wedding, I don't know if you've seen that movie, but they were gonna make it about an Italian family. Like Greek was like way too much for them.
Was
Like
it?
I find that hilarious. And like Nia Vardalos, the main character and the writer of the film, like she just like Tom Hanks he produced the movie, right? And she had the not only the guts to say, well, no, like it needs to be about a Greek family, but she's like, and I also want to be the lead.
Yeah.
And I couldn't think of any other person to play the character. That was perfect. It was such a great movie.
You know, for Crazy Rich Asians, they were gonna whitewash it. It's like, how do you
Uh,
even
I
whitewash
don't
Crazy
know.
Rich Asians? It's in the name.
It's ridiculous. Same with like I look at Aladdin, and I'm just the action feature.
Hmm.
Like I had a friend. because like they didn't cast an Arab actress, and there's so many Arab girls that are like aspiring actresses. I just don't understand,
Mm-hmm.
right? But she was like, oh, but the friend character was Iranian in real life.
Well, and also Mina Masood is Egyptian. Not to take away what you're saying,
Yeah.
but
But I
he's
mean, it just even in that example, it shows that like guys are slightly ahead in like in privilege, you know.
mm-hmm.
But it's not enough, of course, you know. But it's interesting to me because a lot of people from different backgrounds, they kind of fought for the whiteness category in this country, just so they could. It was easier for citizenship, and it was easier to get by in society as far as having a social status. And so even Arabs at one point, Lebanese people specifically even, were considered colored. And I'm pretty sure Italians were, you know, it depends on also what part of the country, especially in Alabama. I was reading randomly on immigration in Alabama, and you know they were considered colored. And what was interesting about that, it worked to their benefit in being able to, you know, because they were peddlers, to be
Mm-hmm.
able to do business on both sides of um, the community. So, and I'm pretty sure even I read. I don't know. You'd have to fact check me, but I'm pretty sure even Asian Americans in court tried to fight for whiteness too. It's just so sad that that's even a thing that we have.
Yeah.
And now, like Arabs, they kind of won their case, and now they're considered white on the consensus, and it brings up this huge identity crisis.
Yeah, I was gonna bring that up because I think that's like interesting that that's a thing that Arab
Yeah,
people are considered white by the
yeah,
U.S. consensus. I
yeah.
mean,
But then I look at like race as a construction in general. I think it's just total BS.
it is kind of
It
dumb
is
because
legitimately. You
I'm
can
gonna
be
edit this part.
Hispanic and still pass as white based off of Western standards. So then
Yeah.
like it leads to all these identity crises, you
Well,
know?
I think it's also because maybe race is such a big thing for us. It's like at the end of the day, it's just socially constructed. It's not
Yeah.
really like a real thing. It's just something that we put so much emphasis on. So then it's hard for other people to like people have identity crises because it's like, oh, am I this? Am I that?
Yeah.
And you know, especially if
Yeah.
you're like a white passing whatever, like a
Yeah.
white passing Hispanic or a white passing like Arab, then you're
Yeah.
like, oh, am I
Yeah,
white?
so there's like, am I can still like considered brown? Am I like what? Because you know, it's more than just color. It's like in your features. It's in the way your eyes are. It's in the way other things that make you who you are. In, you know, part of your people. Even in the past, there was always an identity crisis being an Arab in this country, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
sure even in Asian Americans, like they've dealt with it. Because at one point they would mark you as Ottoman, you know, or they would mark you as Syrian, and you still see residuals of that because people still refer to pita bread as Syrian bread, and it's like not Syrian bread, because if you taste Syrian bread, you taste Lebanese bread, not the same.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just interesting to see residuals of our past kind of like still make its way into our society. We've kind of mentioned that with the foods too, like the MSG
Yeah,
and garlic.
but I just feel like the fuck, I forgot what I was gonna say.
Don't you hate that?
Yeah, whatever.
That could be like a whole segment.
I remember it's dumb because immigration fucking happens all the time.
Yeah.
Like people from like Germany who ran from like the German war from World War II went to like Latin America. So then you have like these people with like German ass last names, and then but they're considered like Latino and
Yeah,
Hispanic.
look at Giselle Bundchen, Tom Brady's wife, you know, the one
Yeah,
that's a model, like, you
he's
know.
Brazilian.
Yeah, yeah. And it's crazy to me because Latin America holds the second largest Arab population in the world.
Yeah,
A
yeah. I
lot
think
of
you've
people went
mentioned
there.
that.
Yeah. So there's a lot of, even, I mean, a lot of Germans fled to Argentina as well. So then what is that? Just this identity. It just, what is that?
What
We
does
can
that
literally
even
talk.
mean? Because
Yeah, we could talk about this for days.
if they came to America, they would still be considered Hispanic, but really they're like German
Yeah.
or Arab
So
or yeah.
it's so confusing. Like that's why it was so hard for me to explain Arab versus Middle Eastern. I mean, for sure, Arab is specific of like, Arab speaking, Arab group, Arab country. And then you have the Middle East where it's like different ethnic groups. And it just gets messy. And I think this whole, like we said, like this whole racial construct, it's a mess.
Yeah, it's
a
dumb,
mess.
honestly.
That can be the closing.
Thank you for listening to the What Even Is podcast. If you like this episode, please share and subscribe. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram at What Even Is podcast so you can DM us a topic that makes you wonder, what even is that?